Welcome to the Independent Tinker and part 2 of our best Stihl Pro chainsaw comparison. And I'd like to also thank all the people who are in part 1 at the Ohio International Firewood Expo. Some people were with manufacturers, some were other YouTubers, so if you watched the entire video, you saw all those people give their opinion. And if you didn't, I just asked, in their opinion, which saw of all of the Stihl Pro saws used the most fuel and which used the least fuel. And I was surprised that most of them gave an answer right away. So thank you to those guys that gave their opinions at the Ohio International Firewood Expo. And without further ado, we'll get to the results. You'll have to excuse me. I keep looking down. I have my notes here. There is a lot to unpack in this comparison. 4.5 ounces. How much your wallet weighs after taking your family out to dinner. How true that is. Unfortunately, credit cards weigh the same before and after. Wouldn't that be great if a credit card got heavier the more balance you kept on it? All right. So, thank you for letting me channel Johnny Carson there, the Swami. So, 261. Took 3 minutes, 39 seconds, and burnt 4.5 ounces of gasoline in order to do that. The 362 took 2 minutes, 58 seconds, and burned 4 ounces and a quarter, 4.25 ounces. One thing to say, this is just me, I'm not a laboratory. So if a 1/4 ounce is probably as accurate as I'm gonna get, and it might be plus or minus 1/4 ounce. So if we're in within a 1/4 ounce of the test results for a saw or 2 saws, they probably are the same. The 400 with 2 minutes 58 seconds, it burnt 4 ounces and a quarter, 4.25 ounces. The 462 with the best time of the small saws, which I'm going to say everything of 661 and smaller, so including the 661 is right here. Everything from 661 and down is what I consider the small saws, because the 881 and the 880 have a different mount for the bar. So to me, these are the big saws, these are the small saws. And this 881 right here, if you place the 661 next to it, it almost makes the 661 look like a toy saw. They are just that big. When you put the 500 or the 462 next to it, it just gets even more hilarious. All right, so the 500. 462. Did I say? No, I did not. So the 400, 4.25 ounces. The 462, which for the small saws was the fastest time on that 10-inch wide, 10-foot long red oak beam, which surprised me. 1:49, and I even stalled the chain out once, and it burnt 3.5 ounces. I do not know if I measured that incorrectly, but it came out 3.5 ounces. So by far the leader so far, time-wise and fuel burn. 500, 1:56, and it burnt 4.25 ounces. 661, 2 minutes, 30 seconds. It burnt 5.5 ounces. So significantly more. And as well as the time. 661, 2.5 minutes, 5.5 ounces. 880, 1:26. Fastest saw so far, and it burnt 5.25 ounces. The 881, the winner of all the saws, and again, the 881 and the 880, we're using a 404 chain that is not optimized for milling. It's just a regular chain. That was 1 minute and 17 seconds. And it burnt 4 ounces. So our winners are the 462 and the 881. It's hard to say which one, as far as fuel economy, was the winner. As far as least amount of fuel, because the 881 did do more work. It was using a chain that's not optimized for milling, as well as a wider kerf, which more material taken out of the beam, and it burnt 1/2 ounce more, but it did it way faster. And if you look at the average of all the saws that were gas saws, we did do a battery saw. The average for all the gas saws, the average amount of fuel burnt was 4.44 ounces. And if you take the best and the worst out, so to remove the possible human error, take our best and our worst fuel economy out, our measured fuel economy, which would be the 462, remove that. Remove the 661. So the 462 is 3.5 ounces, the 661 was 5.5 ounces. If you remove those and you average the remaining 6 saws, the average fuel burn of those 6 was 4.42 ounces. It's just not a lot of difference with these saws. Kind of surprising, but also not surprising, because the same amount of work was done by each saw. It just was the amount of time that it took. And there were 2 saws that kind of stood out. Well, really 3 saws. We had the 462, the 661, and the 880. But the 880 is no longer, it's not a new saw. You can't buy it brand new. The 881 replaced it, and they did updates in order to make it more fuel efficient. And it definitely did. It really was more between 5.25 ounces of fuel burnt on the 880 and 4 ounces on the 881. So for me, and possibly for you, my question was, why did the 661 take so long? Is it just that this saw has the most hours on it for me out of this test? And if I haven't stated it before, every saw is stock. There are no modifications to this saw, these saws. Stock air filters, stock exhaust. You know, those are the 2 main upgrades that people will change on their saw. The intake and the exhaust, and every saw was stock. None of them have been modified other than changing the bar and the chain. They're completely stock. So my question from this test, which I don't care which one wins. I own them all except the 362, but the 362 was right in line with everything else. 4.25 ounces burnt. Took less time than the 261 and more time than the 400. It's also to note that the 400 and the 362 are Mtronic. The 500i is fuel injected. Every other saw is carbureted. So the 462, which burnt the least amount of fuel, as well as the 881, they're just old style carburetor, manually adjusted carburetors. The one that burnt the most fuel, the 2 that burnt the most fuel, the 880 and the 661, also manually adjusted carburetors. So it shows that if you have a carburetor that is tuned, and again, they're all stock. I have not made any adjustments to the carburetors. Every carburetor still has the factory plugs for the carburetor screws, so you can't just put a screwdriver in there. You must remove the plug in order to adjust them. They all have those plugs still in the carburetor adjustment, covering up the carburetor adjustment screws. I haven't even removed those. These truly are stock. It is from the factory. I have done nothing to them other than run them. And it just shows to you, shows to me from this test that a carburetor is not a bad thing. It can, in this cut, the 462 burnt the least. Out of all the saws, it burnt the least. The 881 was the next one, and that is also a manual adjusted carburetor. And so everybody's talking about the 500i and how great the fuel injection is. The Mtronic saws are also computer controlled, so our fuel injected saw is computer controlled. Our Mtronic are computer controlled carburetors, and it shows that when you're at full throttle, there may not be much of a difference between a computer controlled or a manual adjusted carburetor or even fuel injection. And it's not a surprise. Some people swear by carburetors. If you get them tuned just for what you're doing, it's better than fuel injection. I've heard that argument. This kind of shows they might not be off the rocker. The point of a carburetor or fuel injection is to atomize the fuel, to get it to very, very small droplets, so that when it's in the combustion chamber and the spark plug goes off, they all will burn readily. So there's not a lot of difference in this test. Well, there is no difference between fuel injected or carburetor, other than carburetor was the best and carburetor was the worst. The advantage to a computer controlled either carburetor, such as the Mtronic, or the fuel injected, that's carburetor, computer controlled, excuse me, is when you change temperature, change humidity, change elevation. When your atmospheric conditions change, the computer will change for you the metering of the fuel, either by carburetor or by fuel injection. That's the advantage. If you remember a car, maybe your parents drove, or if you're older than I am, that you drove, you may remember having to pull the choke lever in order to get the car to start. And that is something that modern fuel injection will take care of for you. Not particular on this saw, you do have to prime this, but on most modern fuel injected vehicles or pieces of equipment, you do not need to give it extra fuel in order to get the engine to start. That's what is always required on a cold piston engine that's gasoline. You got to give it more fuel than what it normally needs in order for it to fire off when the engine's cold. And on old cars, you'd have to pull the choke, start it up, let it warm up, because you couldn't drive it like normal without either keeping that choke out and metering that as needed. The easiest was just to let it warm up. So fuel injected or computer controlled, either fuel injection or computer controlled carburetor, which is what I sum up the Mtronic as, that's where the advantage is. If I were to take these carbureted saws and go up 8,000 feet, such as in the mountains of Oregon, and I'm trying to cut trees at 8,000 feet, I would have to adjust these carburetors. If I took this 500i up there, all I would need to do is probably just let it idle for a minute, and then I could go and cut like normal. So I'd have to give this thing about a minute probably for it to adjust to the change in the atmospheric conditions. So I was surprised that the fuel injected saw was neither the best nor the worst. It was right in the middle. It was average. And on our way to that Ohio Woodburner Expo, I was surprised when my brother told me that on YouTube some people say that this 500i is thirsty, because in my experience, milling with the 661 and the 500i, my experience was this 500i was much thriftier. And so to hear that this saw was thirsty, I was surprised. Now, yes, it is thirsty. It burnt that 4 1/4 in less time than most of the saws. But compared to other saws, I never found it to be thirsty. So I don't know what their experiences are, but I did a couple more tests that will show, they may not be wrong. It just depends on how you're using the saw, your application, what type of wood you're cutting, and how big a wood you're cutting. Because coming up, one of the tests, this was no longer way out in fuel consumption. The other thing about the part 1 test is that the 261, I sharpened that chain. I used it. I did not like the cut because the bar started pulling up out of the wood. So I put a new chain on the 300, and I ran that same chain for the 362, then the 400. Then the 462 got a brand new chain. And then the 500 and the 661 ran that same chain that the 462 did. Turns out that 20-inch bar that I had was bent, and I know exactly how that happened. One of the logs, I wasn't using the clamps, and I was cutting, trying to save some time. It fell off the log lift on over here, and it was white oak, and it bent the bar. So it was starting to pull up out of the wood. For the 261 was the only one that it was starting to come out. If you watch the video again at the end of the cut, for the remaining saws I made sure to give enough wood so that it wouldn't come out of the cut, but the 261 was the longest cut for a gas saw, so I don't think it mattered too much. It was still cutting wood. So they all had to deal with that bar that it was just slightly bent and possibly twisted, which is maybe why it was lifting. So I'm gonna have to buy a new bar for that, but I use this 28-inch bar and chain. This is a ripping chain or a milling chain for my third test. So I was not satisfied with the results of part 1, the time, as well as the fuel burn, especially with the 661. Why did this take 41 seconds longer than the 462? This is a bigger engine. Is it the fact that this engine has the most hours on it for me, and so it's just wore out? Also, the 500 was 7 seconds slower than the 462 and burnt a little bit more fuel than the 462. So it raised more questions for me than answers, which is how tests go. You think you figured it out, the results throw you for a loop. So I did that test again. I watched that part 1 video and found that the 661 especially, I bogged it down. I felt like the RPMs dropped too much, which is why, in my opinion, the answer that I came up with, this is why it took so much longer. So I ran that cut again on that 10-inch wide, 10-foot long red oak beam, and I did it with the 462 and the 661. And the results of that, before I tell you the results, I put earplugs in. Normally when I'm milling, I wear earplugs, and then I wear that helmet and the ear muffs. I did not wear earplugs. And my thought was, because it's so loud, these saws, once you get, especially the 500 and up, they're so loud that I could not tell that I was bogging the engine down. So I did what I normally do. I put earplugs in, plus the earmuffs, and I tried to keep the RPMs higher. And I was successful, but the 661 took 2 minutes and 51 seconds instead of 2.5 minutes on the first part, the first test, and it burnt 5 3/4 ounces of fuel. So that was a 1/4 ounce more fuel burnt, and it took slightly longer. The 462 was really the surprise. I really tried to keep the RPMs up, and it took 3 minutes 47 seconds, and it burnt 7 ounces of fuel. Big surprise. When I thought about it, not such a big surprise. I've heard that the Stihl saws they have torque. Husqvarna has horsepower, Stihl saws have torque, and that kind of proved it to me. By keeping the RPMs high, they actually took longer and they burnt more fuel. Why did they burn more fuel? It's that stoichiometric. In piston engines, internal combustion piston engines, stoichiometric refers to you have the perfect air-fuel ratio. you have the right amount of air and the right amount of fuel, and when they're burned or combusted together, you will get nothing but carbon dioxide and water as the results. Obviously, that's just on paper, never happens in real life, but for a gasoline engine, you have to run them very close to stoichiometric, which is 14.7 to 1, 14.7 parts of air to 1 part of fuel. And when you're at high idle, when you're keeping it at around 12,000 RPM, it must be near that 14.7 to 1 ratio, and so you're going to burn a lot more fuel if you are going to take way more time to make that cut, because it has to put the same amount of fuel in there. Even I wasn't just holding it at high idle, I was making a cut, so it was under load, and that just shows you why diesels are typically the industrial engine, because a diesel can idle around 50 to 1, so 50 instead of 14.7 to 1 for gasoline. Even if it's idling, if it's at high idle, without being under load, it has to be somewhere around that 14.7 to 1 ratio. And a diesel can be just idling at 50 to 1. When you put it under load, they don't typically go any richer than 20 to 1, even though stoichiometric I think is somewhere around 16 something to 1, because once you get past 20 to 1 with a diesel, you start seeing that soot. And soot is partially burnt diesel fuel. So there's no real reason to go beyond richer than 20 to 1. Also, diesel has more BTUs per gallon if you're going to measure by volume, which is another highlight as to why this is not a scientific test. If it was, I would not be measuring the fuel burnt by volume. It would be by weight, because as temperature changes, volume will change. So this is not a scientific test, but I have not seen anybody do a test like this, and I thought, I want to see that test, so let's do it. All right, so the results of that second cut on the beam: 3 minutes 47 seconds and about 7 ounces burned for the 462. 661, 2 minutes 51 seconds, 5 3/4 ounces burnt. Obviously for me, that didn't answer any questions that I had as to why did the 661 take longer on that part 1. So I thought, why don't I come up with a different test? And this beam it's not a beam, it's a log that you see here. This is a poplar log. It's 12 foot 11 inches long, and this 28-inch bar could not reach all the way through, starting somewhere around here to the end. So much more material being cut with this bar and chain. And I ran the 462, then I ran the 661. I thought, I gotta run the 500i, so I did that last. So the 462 had the easiest time because that end of the log tapers just a little bit. So it's slight advantage to the 462. Then the 661 had the next cut, and then the 500i had slightly more material to remove because the taper was getting to its widest diameter on that end. And I'm very glad that I did this test, because it really highlights why would you own a bigger saw. As you saw in part 1, no pun intended, saw, 462 was our best of the small saws. The 881 was the best overall. And I tried cutting this poplar log with the 881, but I don't have a milling chain, and it only got about 8 to 10 inches into this. And I suppose that when you're cutting 20 inches or more milling, 20 inches more of wood, even though this is a softer species than oak, it just could not do that without a milling chain. So I had to give up. I really wanted to see what the 881 would do on this, but First cut was the 462. It took 5 minutes and 50 seconds. Again, 12 foot long, 12 foot 11 inches long, using a 28-inch bar and a milling chain, and it was 5 minutes 50 seconds, and it burnt 9.5 ounces. The 661 took 5 minutes 54 seconds and burnt 9 3/4 ounces. So the time difference came drastically reduced. The 462 only beat it by 4 seconds, and it did have a slight advantage on a taper on that end. And then the 500i, it only took 5 minutes 24 seconds, and it burnt 6.5 ounces, the same as the 462. So it beat the 462 by 26 seconds and burnt the same amount of fuel. To me, this highlights what a bigger saw is for. It's for bigger diameter wood. Let me get another prop here. If all we were cutting was this diameter wood, would you buy a 90cc saw? What about this diameter? Would you buy a 90cc saw? Would you buy a 70cc saw? I wouldn't. I'd be happy with a 50cc saw. So it's been my opinion that a bigger saw does not cut at a faster speed. It doesn't cut at a faster rate. What happens is when you get into a bigger piece of wood, the bigger saw continues to cut at its pace that it always cuts at, whereas the smaller saw starts to slow down. As you saw in part 1, the 50cc saw took the longest of all the gas saws. So this test reinforced what was my thought before, is that you don't buy a bigger saw in order to cut faster in smaller diameter wood. You have to match the tool to the job, and when you get bigger and bigger and bigger diameter wood, that's when you need a bigger saw. So it'd be interesting to find what diameter of wood is the proper diameter for each saw. At what point do you need to move up to the next bigger saw in order to get the best fuel economy as well as the fastest cut time? Because it seems as though the faster the cut, the better the fuel economy. Or at least, there was no fuel penalty on the second test, but on the first test, the fastest speed, the 462 and the 881, they burnt the least amount of fuel. So tell your significant other, this is why you need another saw. For the proper, you got to get the right tool for the job. And this taught me that this 661 will probably be a dedicated Alaskan mill saw. I have no reason to put this 661 on this Logosol mill. It burns more fuel and it takes more time. But I was milling, which I hope to post this video. I was milling a 14-foot long, about 40-inch wide piece of oak. I was slabbing it for a friend, and I took the 661. This is the saw that I used. I cannot imagine that any other saw except the 881 would be faster or better for the job or more fuel efficient. The only reason I didn't use the 881 is, one, the 50-inch bar that I was using for the 661 for that would not fit on this 881. And I have also been told that when you go above 50-inch bar on an Alaskan mill, that's when you use the 881. If you use it on a shorter bar, it is not counterbalanced by that bar. So you need a longer bar to counterbalance the saw. and I have tried, I milled with this. This is a 41-inch bar that's currently on the 881. I use that for milling, and I kept having to make sure I lift it up as I was milling because it just wanted to tip the end of the bar up out of the wood. So this will probably be my dedicated Alaskan mill saw. This 500i may become my dedicated Logosol milling saw, and maybe I'll put the 32-inch bar, it's a light bar, that I had on this 500i. Maybe that's what's going to go on this 462. So I learned some things from this test, and it does just help me appreciate that I have a saw for each job. If you wish to compare fuel economy and add in that battery saw, as Dan from Back 40 Firewood said, it burnt the least amount of gas, and he is correct, it burnt 0 gas. I tried to do some calculations in order to calculate the amount of electricity used and convert it into the gasoline gallon equivalent in order to find out about how much fuel was burnt for it to make that cut on the 10-inch wide, 10-foot long red oak beam. And it's only an approximation because I do not know exactly how much electricity was used in that battery. And I thought, oh, just today I thought, well, I could have used a kilowatt and measured, or something like that. I could have measured how much electricity we used, but that charger for that battery has a fan, so I still wouldn't know exactly how much electricity was used. Like I said, I'm not a lab, this isn't a scientific test, but from my crude calculations, it was about an ounce of fuel for that battery saw to make a cut on that red oak beam. I tried it a second time. That was the last cut on that part 1 video at night, and that was on the fastest chain speed, and it got to it cut about 9 feet of that log before the battery overheated. So anyway, back to it burnt about an ounce of fuel. So clearly that's the winner, right? Well, you have to then consider, how is that electricity generated? How is it transmitted? And you're back to, in my crude calculations, probably about 3 to 4 ounces of fuel burnt. The equivalent, 3 to 4 ounces of fuel burnt in order to make that cut with the battery saw. So it still could have been the most fuel efficient if you calculate it over into gasoline gallon equivalent. And that battery is also charged most of the time by solar panels. I have solar panels here at the house, and so obviously it burnt the least amount of fuel. But also, yes, to consider, solar panels are extremely energy intensive to create them. So at some point they will be on the net positive side of energy, but I don't know when. So yes, it burnt the least amount of fuel. Even if you calculate it over, it still may have been the least amount of gasoline burnt equivalent, but that was as much as it could do, basically, was that beam. And then the battery is done, had to charge it, and on a warm day it takes a very long time to charge, which is why in the owner's manual it says charge it inside in a cool environment. So the outlier in part 1 is this 881. It was the fastest saw of all of them, and it did not burn a whole lot of fuel. It was the second best in that test. So compared to the 661, it seems like the 661 is designed for torque, for those long bars, for it to be able to pull that chain through the wood on a long bar. But the 881 is a saw that lets you have your cake and eat it too. You can have that long bar, and you can cut fast through the wood, and also use very little fuel doing it. So if you were to buy one saw, this is probably the saw to have. I don't suggest it though, because it's the most expensive saw by far, very expensive, and it's also with this 41-inch bar and chain on it. I weighed it. It's about, when full bar and chain oil, it's about 35 pounds. And then I weighed the 261 full of fuel and bar and chain oil, and it was 15 pounds. So it's a 20-pound difference to go from a 50cc saw to a 122cc saw. So if you're willing to put out the money for this saw, as well as lift this beast around for every cut you need to make, I think it hands down is the best saw. But I would much rather have that 261 for the majority of the cuts that need to be made. And this test, part 1 and part 2, has proven to me that it's best to use the smallest saw that you can for the job. And as you get into bigger diameter wood, that's why they make bigger saws. So it may cut, a bigger saw might be marginally faster for most cuts, but when you get to that bigger diameter, that's when the bigger saw is faster. So if you could, in my opinion, from these tests, if you can own one saw, might be this 462, that might be the winner. But if you're never owned a chainsaw, and this is the first time, my first saw was a 35cc saw, the MS210. I would suggest something like that. 35 to 50cc saw, cc saw, cubic centimeter saw. The 261 is a great option. The best thing about those small saws is that they take a long time to cut through the wood. And why is that the best thing? Because if you cut a tree down and you're cutting along that tree, taking some limbs off, you can start to see when it's pinching your blade. You got something under compression. The tree's falling down, it's being held up off the ground by the limbs. As you cut through that limb, you can see it start to pinch your blade or bar. And that's the best thing about those small saws. If you don't have experience, I would suggest a very small saw. If you do have experience, you know what you're doing, this 462 from these tests, it might be the best saw to have. I've really enjoyed the 400. This 500, to me, I didn't like to run it until I got into bigger wood. Once I got into large diameter wood, this was the saw I wanted, because it just loves cutting through large diameter wood. But you get smaller diameter wood, to me it wasn't fun. The saw is meant for bigger wood, and this test, this comparison, has kind of proven that to me. And this may become my dedicated Logosol mill. It's just going to use it on this, and then this will be my big saw. This 462 will be my big saw until I need to get something really big, and I'll get this 881 out. One thing of note about part 2 test in this poplar log that's over 20 inches in diameter, every saw, the 462, the 661, and the 500i, that all had brand new chains. Each one got a brand new chain, so there's 3 chains used for that test, so that variable's out. I don't think that a brand new chain is necessary for every single cut, but since I had them for this 28-inch bar, I used them. In my experience, milling the chain, it obviously dulls out, but it's very slow. But when you get to where it's dull, it's like it just falls off a cliff. It just does not cut anymore. So the fact that in the part 1, each saw had to use, I only used 3 different chains until we got to the 880 and 881. There's only 3 chains used for the small saws. I don't feel as though that was a determining factor in the speed. I also don't think that the 661 is wore out, because when we got into this bigger diameter wood, it would have fallen even further behind if there was something wrong with this saw. It would have used way more fuel, and it would have taken even longer compared to the other saws. And instead, it was the second fastest saw. Let me check my notes here. I know that it only burnt a 1/4 ounce more fuel. Sorry, it was the slowest saw, but it was only 4 seconds slower. So to me, you get an even bigger diameter wood, put a 50-inch bar and chain on these saws. The 661 would be the winner of these smaller saws. And that's because this one just keeps cutting at its speed while the other ones have to slow down. Not just, I don't mean slow down the chain, but you have to slow down your cut because it can't cut at the rate that the 661 will cut at. But when you're cutting something smaller, these smaller saws can cut at their speed because they're not maxed out. Once you max out the smaller saw, then you need the next bigger saw, as seen with this part 2, the cut on this poplar log. I have removed the bark from it, but as seen on this poplar log, 28-inch bar and chain, the 500i was the fastest, and it used the same amount as the 462. So it really just shows, again, to repeat myself, it shows that you need to match the saw to the job. And you have to get into some pretty big wood for you to move up to, say, the 500i or the 661. Or this is about an 80cc class saw, this is about 90cc class saw, this is about a 70 class cc saw. 72, 79, 661. 91, sorry. To address the opinion of some that were given about which saw was going to be the most fuel efficient, it was said that it's going to be the biggest saw because it's not working so hard. My answer was I tried to make them all work at the exact same rate or put them under the same amount of load. It's just that the 881 was under the load the least amount of time. As far as gasoline saws, the 261 was under load the most amount of time. So for this poplar log cut, if we assume that the saws were spinning, the engines were spinning at 10,500 RPM, and I chose that number arbitrarily because it makes the math easy. I don't know exactly what they were spinning, but you do have to put these under load in order to get the fast cut. Not just load, but you need to slow down the RPMs. And if you're spinning at 10,500 RPM in the cut, then that turns out to be 175 revolutions per second. That means the engine turns over 175 times every second. And if you have a 5.5 minute cut, which this 500i was 5 minutes 24 seconds, the other ones were 550 and 554. So let's just go with 5.5 minutes for the cut. That means that the engine spun 57,750 times to do this cut. That's significant. That's why on these bigger saws, like the 881, or even the 462 on the part 1 test, and the 500i, that's why you're going to see less wear on the bigger diameter wood. If you got even bigger than this poplar log, 661 should take less time than the 500. But when you're spinning that many times to make one cut on this mill, just almost 60,000 revolutions that engine's turned over in order to make one cut. If you can decrease the time, then you can decrease the wear on your saw. And that is one reason why I use high quality products. Amsoil, the Saber Professional 2-stroke oil. I'll show you a 2-stroke engine. There's the cylinder, here's the piston, connecting rod, and the crankshaft right here. So this has, in this cut, for this saw, it had to spin almost 60,000 times. That means from there That's one. 60,000 times in order to make this cut, especially for these other saws that took more time. It's going to be around 60,000 times. If you look at this cylinder, it's at top dead center. We spin one revolution, it's back to 10, top dead center. Well, in the cylinder, the piston goes from its top speed to completely stopped. And then to go to bottom dead center, it speeds up to its top speed. It accelerates to the piston's top speed. And then completely decelerates to 0 when it gets to bottom dead center. Then it has to reverse course, accelerate to its fastest speed, the piston speed, get to top dead center, and it decelerates to 0. And it does that. And these, for this cut, was 60,000 times for this saw. That's revolutions per minute. Well, sorry, revolutions. It's 60,000 revolutions per cut for this. Not RPM, like RPC. Revolutions per cut, 60,000. So let's go back to 57,750 revolutions for this 500i. For the cylinder to go from the top, so we're going to assume it was running, the engine was running, this piston comes to the top, so it decelerates to 0, accelerates, goes to 0, accelerates, and again and again and again. Well, that in one revolution, so that's half a revolution, and it stopped, goes to full revolution, and it stopped again. So this piston has to accelerate and decelerate to 0. It has to come back to 0 twice every revolution. That's important if you look at the Strybeck curve, which, getting a little technical, maybe beyond my understanding here, but the Strybeck curve talks about the type of lubrication that any metal part or any part experiences. And when it's at 0 movement, then it's just metal to metal. Yeah, so you got this piston inside this metal bore, that's metal to metal. And as it accelerates, it goes to a boundary layer, or a mix layer, I'm sorry, a mix layer. So the boundary layer is just boundaries touching each other, metal on metal. As it accelerates, you get a little bit of mix between the oil and the metal on metal. And then as it gets to a certain speed, and it's not a lot of speed, but again, this is going from full speed to 0 twice every revolution. When it's at 0, there's no lubrication provided from the oil. That is where the additive package comes in. So I use a high quality oil, this Amsoil Saber Professional 2-stroke oil, for those times, because it's twice a second. That's for this cut, for this saw, that's roughly 115,500 times that piston was at 0, a speed of 0. Then it accelerated to its fastest speed and decelerated to 0 again. And if you look at this piston and this bore, it shows a lot of wear right here. It's something that you would expect from, a lot of use. So in order to get the maximum life and the maximum power out of my equipment, I use a Saber Professional 2-stroke oil. And we've also used the semi-synthetic bar and chain oil. On the new saws, I wish I knew about this before on all of my saws, but the new ones that I buy, I now put Mudslinger on. And I can literally just wipe the dust and the dirt and the oil, everything that the saw experiences while I'm cutting, I can just wipe it off by hand. And then this is not the oil or grease that I use, but this is the only one that's not in a grease gun that I have currently. But I use a high quality oil from Amsoil in order to grease the bearing that is right underneath this housing. See that spinning? Engine's not spinning, and I'm able to turn it. There's a bearing right there riding on the crankshaft, so that when the engine's spinning, The chain's not, so it would be the opposite. The engine's running, but this is not spinning. So I can spin this because there's a bearing there, and every once in a while you do need to lubricate that, and we can show that in a video at a later date, how to do that on these Stihl saws, or Stihl saws, or Stihl saws, however you like to pronounce it. So if you'd like any of these products, please go to the link in the description below, which is theindependentttinker.shopamsoil.com. It's possible that these comparison videos, part 1 and part 2, have confirmed your opinions or shattered them. I had plenty of people who said that the 500i is thirsty. Well, it very well may be thirsty if it's used in an application where it's not the best for that saw, such as this 661. In part 1, it was the thirstiest saw that we used. Out of all 8 gas saws, 661 used the most fuel. In part 2, where we have used this Poplar log, this 500i matched the 462, and the 462 was by far the most fuel efficient in part 1. So when people say the 500i is thirsty, well, it might just be the application that they're using it in. It might not be the ideal application for that saw. I have no idea. It's just an opinion that they gave, and the point of all this is their opinion may be valid, because I don't know the circumstances in which it's being used, and that 500i might be thirsty compared to other saws for what it's being used in. And as the test showed in part 1 and part 2, when you put the saw in its intended application, it shows that it's the fastest and the most fuel efficient. I'm extrapolating a bit from just a few tests, a few cuts here, where we measured the time and the fuel, so I may be wrong. All of this may be wrong. Like I said, I'm not a lab. I am not so accurate that this is infallible. I may have mismeasured some of these, but the fact that on the first test, the average fuel economy was only 0.02 ounces different from when you take the best and the worst fuel economy measurements out. 4.44 ounces burned. On average, if you take the best and worst out, it's 4.42 ounces. So again, most of them all landed on a 1/4 ounce. I really didn't have to round either way. It was very interesting to me that they landed on a 1/4 ounce. But this isn't, like I keep saying, it's not a lab. If it was a lab, I would not measure by volume. We would measure by weight. We probably wouldn't even be cutting wood, because wood is not perfect. It has knots in it. It has other things that would skew the test. So to remove all variables, we would control the atmospheric conditions. We would weigh the fuel instead of by volume, and we would probably use a dynamometer in order to drop the RPMs and put the saw at the correct RPM load, and we would measure from there. So those are just things that I would see would be done differently. There are probably more things that would be done differently if this was a lab, but like I said, I've never seen anything like this done anywhere else, and I wanted to know the results, so I figured you'd want to know the results. So please put in the comments what you think, if there's anything that I could change if we were to do a test in the future, especially if we did a different brand. The reason that I've used the saws that I've used is I've put out our own funds for these saws, for the bars and chain, even for the Amsoil products. I purchased these in order to use them personally, as well as for these videos. These are not given to me. Everything has been purchased, except for the 362, which was borrowed from my neighbor. So thank you. I really appreciate that. And so if there's anything that you think could be improved or take a variable out in these tests, please let me know. Maybe for the next test, if there ever is, if you have an interest, let me know. I'm sure that people would love to know the difference between Husqvarna and Stihl. I just can't afford to buy all those saws from Husqvarna or even Echo or any other reputable brand. I'm pretty maxed out on my saws, in my budget for my saws. So I would love to see the difference between Husqvarna and Stihl. Maybe we can make that happen in the future. If there's anything else that you'd like to see, please let me know. Thank you for joining me on The Independent Tinker. You can go to the link in the description below for these Amsoil products, and please consider becoming a preferred customer, or if you have a business with a fleet of either vehicles or equipment, or if you're a retail operation such as a shop or a storefront, we can help you with that as well. Just go to the link in the description below, which is theindependenttinker.shopamsoil.com. And thank you for joining us on The Independent Tinker.